The American bison, buffalo, once numbering around 30 million in the wild, faced near extinction following the European colonization of the Americas. The settlers relentlessly hunted the bison, leading to one of the largest wildlife massacres in history. By 1884, the wild bison population had dwindled to just 300 individuals. A famous photograph from the late 19th century shows hunters standing atop a massive, pyramid-like heap made entirely of bison skulls. What led to this decimation? Why did the American Army target the bison so ruthlessly? Welcome to Wonderworld. Before we begin, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to receive our videos. The bison is a massive type of cattle that was once widespread across the prairies and grasslands, stretching from Alaska in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south. It was considered the largest mammal on the North American continent. The indigenous peoples of the Americas relied heavily on the bison, viewing it as a valuable resource. They consumed its meat, used its summer hides to make tents, and crafted blankets and winter clothing from its winter hides. Even the bones and horns were utilized to make tools. Despite the bison's ability to reproduce in large numbers, with wild populations estimated between 30 million and 60 million, the indigenous peoples only hunted the bison to meet their needs, respecting it as a crucial part of their culture. This harmonious situation began to deteriorate with the arrival of Europeans. By the 1850s, Europeans had firmly established themselves in the Americas, and the United States had declared its independence decades earlier. However, indigenous peoples still populated the continent, particularly in the central western regions of the United States, known as the Great Plains. These indigenous groups, often called Plains Indians, posed a significant challenge to the European settlers. The term Indians itself is a European misnomer. The correct term for these people is simply indigenous peoples. The European explorers mistakenly believed they had reached India when they discovered the Americas, and thus called the natives Indians, not realizing it was an entirely new land. The Plains Indians resisted the European encroachment fiercely, hindering the settlers' westward expansion. The European settlers aimed to confine all indigenous peoples to small reservations, seizing their lands under the so-called Manifest Destiny doctrine, which held that Americans were destined to expand westward. However, the indigenous resistance, aided by their familiarity with the complex terrain, presented a formidable obstacle. The Plains Indians were skilled fighters and horsemen, whereas the Americans, still recovering from a civil war, were ill-prepared for further conflict. To overcome this resistance, the American Army devised a cunning strategy. General William Sherman proposed, "Don't target the Plains Indians directly. Instead, eliminate the bison, their primary resource. Starve them into submission and force them to seek our help." Unlike the indigenous peoples, who had no external support, the Americans could import everything they needed from Europe. The American Army then gave the green light to thousands of European hunters to slaughter the bison. Despite treaties between the Army and tribal leaders prohibiting hunters from entering indigenous lands, the Americans routinely violated these agreements. They even protected the hunters and supplied them with weapons and ammunition. The U.S. cavalry also joined the campaign, actively participating in the bison extermination. When the indigenous peoples protested and human rights organizations intervened, a symbolic decision was made by the U.S. Congress in 1874 declaring bison hunting illegal. However, President Ulysses S. Grant opposed and annulled this decision, stating, "Anyone who wants to hunt, let them hunt." The Americans even began promoting recreational hunting, inviting Europeans to come to America for bison hunting as a form of celebration. They sent invitations to athletes and celebrities in Europe, encouraging them to participate. Thousands of bison were killed daily. In 1876, one European hunter killed 5,800 bison in just 2 months, averaging about 100 bison per day. The situation worsened as Americans realized there was a high demand for leather in Europe. They began promoting the use of bison hides, further increasing the rampant hunting. One of the most heinous practices was that hunters would shoot bison, take their hides, and leave the meat to rot on the ground. Some hunters even poisoned the meat to prevent anyone from eating it. If wolves ate the poisoned meat, they would die too, and the hunters would take their fur, leaving the carcasses. If any indigenous person found the meat and ate it, they would face the same fate. After the meat decomposed, hunters collected the remaining bones and skulls for display or to grind into fertilizer. This is the time when the infamous photograph mentioned earlier was taken. The Plains Indians watched helplessly as Americans decimated their crucial resource. Initially, they did not understand why this was happening, or why Europeans had stopped attacking them directly. Over time, the grim reality became clear, but unfortunately, it was too late. Bison numbers had plummeted, leaving the indigenous people without their primary food source. By the late 1880s, wild bison populations ranged from 300 to 500 individuals, with some estimates suggesting as few as 100 remained. This insidious strategy succeeded, and the Americans triumphed over the Plains Indians. Deprived of their food resources, the Plains Indians were forced to submit to the Americans, abandon their lands, and move to designated areas where they were confined in exchange for food provided by the colonizers. European companies then exploited these lands, establishing tourist and recreational parks where the Plains Indians once lived. Ironically, after subjugating the Plains Indians and confining them, Americans began lamenting the drastic decline in bison numbers, proclaiming, "This is unacceptable. Animals have rights too." They assumed the role of moral guardians, banning hunting and arresting anyone who hunted bison illegally. They transformed the bison from a thriving species into one on the brink of extinction. Fortunately, some wealthy Americans had preserved a few bison on their private ranches. The U.S. government took these bison along with the remaining wild ones, placed them in large reserves, and cared for them for many years, allowing their numbers to increase again. Currently, bison numbers have reached about 500,000. While this is a fraction of their original population, they were ultimately saved from extinction. Eventually, some bison were released back into the plains to reintegrate into the wild. Thus, the bison issue was somewhat resolved, but the plight of the indigenous peoples remains largely forgotten. This concludes our story. Who made it to the end? To those who did, you are the best. Please give us a like before you leave, so we know how many reached the end. And don't forget, if you have any episode suggestions, write them in the comments. Goodbye.